dangerous adventure, leading to irreversible consequences and possible mass deaths of innocent civilians. Because people are not guilty of anything, they are innocent, and I'd like to explain, and we explain it on a regular basis, that there are no frontiers for radiation. It doesn't have visas or permissions or passports. You cannot put it and include it in a list of sanctions. So it's much more a serious matter, and it doesn't ask for permission to penetrate somewhere and to exercise a critical influence on the health and lives of human beings. I'd like to recall that on October the 6th, President Zelensky spoke by video link. If someone says that this statement hasn't taken place, I would like to highlight that it has. It was at the Lowy Institute in Australia, and he spoke very frankly about the use of nuclear weapons. And I'd like to highlight, not by Russia, but by NATO. He addressed NATO countries, and he urged the alliance to launch preventive strikes against our country and not to wait for Russia to use nuclear weapons. Who thinks that it is not true? If there are people like that, you can just find this statement by Zelensky at the Lowy Institute in Australia as of the 4th of October. Why does the Kiev regime need all this? To do what? Because they are trying to prove that they are future-oriented, modern, pragmatic people. Maybe there are no contradictions. Maybe they are future-oriented, but they are oriented into their own future. And maybe this nuclear blackmail is used by Kyiv, among other things, to get more and more financial and military aid. As for the financial aid, it's for them, because a lot of this financial assistance stays on their accounts. And they need military aid to protect themselves, not to protect the citizens of Ukraine. In October the 25th, Berlin hosted an expert conference on Ukraine's reconstruction. On the eve of the event, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz and European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen even published an article about the need to develop a Marshall Plan for the 21st century for Ukraine.
Странами Европейского Союза, группой 7 финансовым институтам, международным организациям, ну и, конечно, частным инвесторам предлагалось взять Украину чуть ли не на полное содержание, десятилетиями спонсируя ее восстановление. Изыскать средства на эту благотворительность.
The European Union intends to raise by confiscating frozen Russian assets. Ursula von der Leyen made it clear that the European Union is ready to finance Ukraine in 2023 at the level of 1.5 billion euros per month, which will require the allocation of at least 18 billion euros. She also mentioned that in reality, Kyiv's needs are several times greater. The Ukrainian authorities for a long time have not concealed their parasitical sentiments. Welcomed this attitude. Prime Minister Shmyhal said at the same conference that he counted on the West to create a financial Rammstein for Ukraine and to urgently allocate $17 billion to the country for the top priority social and economic needs by the end of this year. Judging by the growing military spending in Ukraine, it is unlikely that these sums will go to pensions and salaries of its citizens. So these money are needed under the pretext of restoration they need to destroy. We noted that the West has already provided Kyiv with $42.3 billion in military aid, more than half of which, about $28.3 billion, comes from the United States. Recently, the Pentagon published the information from which it follows that the part of the mentioned means was used for the delivery of nearly 1 million of 155mm shells for M777 howitzers, 3,000 Excalibur guided missiles, 10,000 shells for the anti-tank system RAMS, and 180,000 shells for the 105 millimeter guns. In total, more than 50,000 tons of artillery ammunition. So it's great. The other day, the Ukrainian Defense Minister, Reznikov, frankly admitted in an interview with American publication Politico, said that his country had become, literally say, for the second time, a combat testing ground for Western weapons against the Russian army. Because for the first time, they used it, this quotation, as a call. He said, have a look. Ukraine is a wonderful country, so bring new technologies and arms to our country and whatever you want to test. As you know, the civilized world, as he calls Ukraine, even uses cosmetics on animals. So it is very convenient to use arms on the citizens, to test arms on the citizens of Ukraine. As an example, Reznikov cited the use of NATO howitzers of various designs by the Ukrainian armed forces. In his view, Western military manufacturers are literally competing with each other, and I quote, to see which one will be more effective in the field. So he's talking about his own country. I understand quite well. The country is in the state of war. It demands weapons, but here it's all about philosophy, about beliefs. How could he say that? So please supply us more weapons which we have not tested, so you can do this on our own citizens. So I've read a lot, documents, I've watched videos with a direct speech or with a description which described the actions by extremists and terrorists, because you have to know about terrorist acts, their ideology. And I need to say that all those against whom these weapons were tested, no matter whether they were improvised, self-improvised bombs or professional bombs, they called all of them as enemies. They called them the enemies of humanity, of their country, of their ideology, and they used it against their own citizens, and they tested them on those whom they considered as their own citizens. As you know, in 2010, after the so-called Arab Spring, a new phenomenon started to emerge, ISIS. For the first time in the human history, it's an extremist grouping which claimed the creation of its own state. It had its own funds, its own symbols, which was elevated to the rank of the state status from their point of view. They did not claim the dominance over some kind of territory. They claimed the creation of their own caliphate. So it was for the first time, and the world has never experienced that. So I would like to say that what is done by the Kiev regime, in my opinion, it is done for the first time. No matter how terrible, cruel fighters were in the past, they have never suggested testing the new weapons on their own citizens, which, from their point of view, defend their own country. It's a kind of... It's not about the people whom they segregated at the national language or professional level. They just divided them into bad and good ones. As for the bad guys, they urge to do so. No, they are calling to do these things against the good guys, and they suggest using them as samples. I don't know. And the same categories in the world. I know civil wars, I know confrontations, which led to protracted internal conflicts. So the world has experienced a lot. But when the country tests foreign weapons on its own citizens, so he said, you didn't use your howitzers, so we are ready. our land is ready for such tests. So that is the logic of the Kiev regime. So it seems it comes up that the business circles of the European Union, ignoring the opinion of their own citizens, are financing an army, the Nazi regime in Kiev, and benefiting from billions of dollars in arms production contracts. So this comes in a parallel with their statements on the need to stop this bloodshed, to sit at the negotiation table, but this only protracts the conflict settlement and triggers the worsening of the economic situation, as well as in the Western countries and so on and so forth. So this is done by the Western countries, and it was they who spoke about the food security a few months ago. At the same time, the European Union, the European citizens are invited to tighten their belts in order not only to survive the consequences of European anti-Russian sanctions, but also to pay for the maintenance of the Ukrainian economy in a lifelike state. So it's an absurd. It's absolutely illogic. And once again, all this is happening against the backdrop that social figures almost every day declare that Russia does not want any negotiations. So we have recently published quotations from from representatives of the Kiev regime and other public figures who were then took the form as legislative acts, which bans any negotiations with other countries. At the same time, according to the UN World Food Programme, more than 50 million people in 45 countries are at risk of hunger. This year, the World Food Programme will need $24 billion to reach 153 million people. That this year, according to this information, needs between the demands and finance, the gap is much greater now than ever before. So what's the connection? You can remember a few months ago, Washington said that you need to engage everything possible to fight and to combat food insecurity. I'm not talking about just food insecurity for those who got used to eat good food, but for those who need them badly. So this deal was closed. I mean, the deal was signed. Washington immediately silenced. Why? Many million people experience acute food insecurity. So why are we not discussing this right now? Because it was not food which was delivered to those who are in need, but we feeded all those American companies who supplied these grains from the territory of Ukraine. They just not only promoted the interests of their producers, manufacturers and business circles, not even mediators, but just those who speculated, and they used Ukrainian grain in order to raise huge funds. Some Ukrainian citizens, Ukraine, Russia, they don't bother. And here I cite figures which confirm that the problem with the hunger in the world has been it aggravated during the pandemic and was triggered because of Ukraine, which is fueled, as we know, by supplies of huge amounts of weapons by the West. And at the same time, the West does not listen to demands of those countries who need such food. Contrary to such democracies prefer to sponsor the extermination of civilians in Ukraine, thus violating the most important human right, the right to life. So these huge funds, I would like to reiterate, these huge funds that are spent, at least some percent of this huge financing to stimulate, to direct at those things which the Western civilization, whose values the Western civilization shared, against the backdrop of spending Ukraine. So this is a hypocrisy. It can be proved by statistics on the export of grain from Ukrainian territory. There's further proof on this. One more example of the perversive hypocrisy of the West was to our attention. October 19, the European Parliament, by its resolution, awarded the Andrei Sakharov Prize, as they said, and I quote, to the Ukrainian people represented by Vladimir Zelensky, and end of quote. What is surprising in granting this honor to the representatives of the criminal Kiev regime, it seems that the European parliamentaries intentionally overlooked the fact that Andrei Sakharov was convinced. I would like to recall that what Andrei Sakharov said himself. And I have this quote. So he said that he believes it necessary, vital, that he does not see that Ukraine can exist without this unified, our own shared identity. So this is to the question of the position of Sakharov. And his prize is being granted to the man who considers human beings who acted against and fought for this kind of units as subhumans. He said that they are subhumans. I understand that it sounds, you cannot believe in this. It is impossible to believe. So it cannot be possible when all the parts of this, all the small puzzles can be complemented in one picture. It's a kind of a terrible, mystification. It's kind of a revelation, what we see in front of our eyes, and we can ask, how can this possible in reality? So we see that this is happening. Of course, we will make a reference all the quotes in order for someone among the European parliamentaries will have a look, had the possibility to have a look at who this person is. On October 25-27 this year, a parliamentary summit of the so-called Crimea platform was held in Zagreb. We have already said that more than once that the events within the framework of this initiative by Kiev to deoccupy Crimea are a priori Russophobic for many years, and we have always considered it as a threat to territorial integrity of our country. This was directly confirmed by President Zelensky, who said that the Crimea platform should give a start to the creation of other similar platforms in order to, he said, weaken Russian influence in Transnistria and Abkhazia, as well as to return the northern territories to Japan. So how can this be? So, so he does not. So he just decided for himself at home. So now he can go to the Far East and deal with this issue. In fact,
the Kiev regime and its masters gathered together one more time. They demonstrated that they do not care Crimean citizens and their opinion. They do not care about the opinion of the citizens of Crimea, their democratic institutions and values, but a referendum was held there, but they do not care about that. So the statement made by in Kiev because of Zagreb's forum is another evidence. Secretary of the National Security and Defense Council of Ukraine, Mr. Danilov, noted that in case the hydroelectric power plant in Kakhovsk is blown up, and I would like to say that the Ukrainian armed forces is still shelling, so then the Crimea would become without water supply for 10 or 15 years or maybe forever. So one more time, yes, it is a state that is in the center of Europe. It is one of the greatest European states. Let alone Russia. Well, we're not speaking about Russia. But that is why we have always thought that in Europe it is impossible. It is impossible to see this situation in Ukraine. Maybe terrorists or extremists can act like that, maybe somewhere else in the Middle East, but the West has been always imposing a terrorist image, this cultural specific, that terrorists are of particular beliefs or religious. So it was imposed by them, and that is why right now it is so difficult, or it is almost impossible to believe this situation, to trust in what we are seeing right now. It is the terrorist regime in the very center of Europe, and if a person who represents the greatest structure in the state, if this person can state that a civilian facility of civilian infrastructure could be blown up and people will be without water supply for 10 or 15 years, and his armed forces are carrying out it. So what should we do? What should we have to be convinced in its extremist logics of this regime? So one more time, I would like to say that this is not biased information. It is a direct site. It was not interpreted by someone. No, it is his site, and we can interpret it word by word. Did it happen right now? No, not at all. I would like to remind you that electric lines were detonated long before this accident. So the water supplies were blown up long before this situation. So it is their logics. They have been doing so for a lot of time. So these facts confirm the correctness of the Russian policy in Ukraine and the important point of our of the aims of the special military operation, and they will be achieved. So, by the way, the American digital platform has blocked our English language account for a period of 7 days. Do you know why? So right now the reason is a 10-minute video in the English language where we, with our experts and specialists, collected I'm saying that the Russian foreign minister, with these experts, we collected information on provocations carried out by the Kiev regime in Bucha, Izum, and Kupiansk. So it only included video and photo evidence, as well as a unique interview prepared by the Foundation for Democracy Research. So this material includes sensitive issues, as well as numerous inconsistencies, fake versions proposed by the Western media, proposed by Anglo-Saxon mainstream media and bloggers who are either afraid of or do not want to voice the truth. So this 10-minute video was blocked. So is it democracy? Is it possible? Please wait a minute. In only one country of the world can decide what is a freedom of speech and what is poisonous for public opinion. Or can we assume that there are several points of view, there are different approaches? So what do you think about it? These issues were raised not in 2022. but a lot of several years ago. So this publication, not long ago, but this publication gained momentum and had 100,000 views only on this platform. But this video was published on all the websites of our disposal. And do you believe they explained this action? No, they blocked the video without any explanations, and the American IT corporations defends the truth about the Kiev regime, and it only can state that they are in the same boat. They're acting together as a criminal community that has political information or military support, and they use democratic institutes contrary to its initial goal. So, by the way, not long ago, Elon Musk, who bought this IT platform, he positions himself as a champion of freedom of expression. So I believe that it would be very interesting to see what is going on here, because it is a fact. And he himself stated that the platforms of social media should be independent, should be the place to defend freedom of expression, not by words but by deeds, defended by the very existence. So how can we call this digital through the looking glass? You can watch this video on other platforms, and it was published in the English language Telegram channel of the Russian foreign ministers, on the resources of permanent missions of the Russian Federation. So the truth cannot be erased or blocked, and we will publish on the information of our disposal. Let's move on. As you know, on the 25th of October, Rishi Sunak took office as a new Prime Minister of the UK, and then he spoke publicly. He made a statement, and we took notice that in his first public statement, he used the same notorious thesis about Russia's alleged responsibility for economic hardship the world is facing. So that means that the new British leadership is going to continue with its Russophobic politics of its predecessors. So taking into account the anti-Russian consensus in the British political establishment, we didn't expect a different approach from this new Prime Minister. But I believe that if we are talking about this analysis, quote unquote, he should provide some facts, and we are waiting the British party to develop this thesis, to explain this thesis that was voiced and used by the British Prime Minister. So I believe that this thesis should be proved by evidence, by facts, and we ask them to provide some charts and data. So the attempt of Rishi Sunak to shift the blame for Moscow for numerous mistakes in the Conservatives' economic program should alert the British citizens. So we can only recommend him to take an objective look at the situation inside the UK and address pressing problems in the British economy. And I would like to remind that London and its official structures, let alone public figures, characterized this situation as an internal, deep economic crisis. Not long ago, they called the reasons that exacerbated the situation, so unprofessional actions made by ex-Prime Minister of Britain. So we're not guilty because it was her program, it was her actions that provoked another spiral of economic crisis in Britain. And right now, the representatives comes and says it, we believe that it is the problem of the Conservative Party, and we suppose that um, that he blames Russia not to blame his own Conservative Party. So, but you shouldn't shift this blame. We believe that you should provide all the explanations to your own citizens, to your own nationals. But by the way, they were not allowed to choose this new prime minister. That is why um, they did not choose him. It is an interesting story in the UK, how prime ministers are appointed to this position. But one more time, we can see it. And by the way, the use of Russophobia and political cliches, so it will never help Britain to resolve the problem of public debt, or it will never bring the country out of recession and reduce inflation rates. So if we're talking about Russia, you can establish economic context with us, and maybe the British economy will gain momentum, but it's another story. It has nothing to do with accusations against Russia. So one more time, I would like to note that it is surprising. We're very surprised with the British policy, and they shouldn't blame Russia for their mistakes. One more time, the British voters didn't appoint the new prime minister. Then it was a decision of 193 members of the House of Commons. So this is the reality. Let's proceed to Moldova. We are concerned with the situation in Moldova, which is historically close to us. There are thousands of popular protests taking place in the country because people are dissatisfied with the decisions of the authorities. So a lot of people have different citizenships. For example, citizenship of Romania. I won't comment on the actions of the authorities to suppress these protests because it is up to the Moldovan people to give assessments.
I would like to note another thing, the thing that has to do with us. Unfortunately, these events go hand in hand with the exacerbated anti-Russian rhetorics by the officials of this country. It borders pure Russophobia, and it got to a point where some members of the ruling party, Action and Solidarity, urged the parliament to recognize Russia as a terrorist regime. Of course, we take note of such anti-Russian statements, and they will not be left without any response. Another alarming trend is the gradual hyping of a Russian threat, some kind of a Russian threat in Moldova. The goal is evident: to prepare the public opinion for the increased defense spending and to justify bolstered cooperation with NATO and the EU in order to protect the Moldovan neutrality. We had good relations with both Moldova and its citizens. You do know that there were a lot of Moldovan citizens that came to Russia to get a job here. They had wonderful life. They got back home, and everything went smoothly until pro-Western political officials, or maybe officials that were bought by the West. Some of them were pretty creative, by the way, but they led their citizens to the abyss under some colored banners of some Western values, and they didn't ask themselves what was the ultimate point. Of course, a lot of funds were invested into this ideology, and the process was launched, but they struck this chord, and for the past decade, the ties between the people were strengthened, but they try to sever these ties, and they do it in a painful way. There were a lot of families, a lot of shared projects, shared families, people working in Russia, and these people were affected. They do not care about that because they only think about the money that they got to hype on this position. Of course, we have repeatedly commented on this, and we drew the attention to this for quite some time. Let me reiterate that the threat to Moldovan neutrality is presented not by Russia, but by Western military and technical assistance, as they call it. The genuine goal of this assistance is to ensure the interests of the West and not to ensure the security of Moldova. And it is showcased once again by the drills of the US and the maneuvers of the US military close to Moldova. In this regard, we took note of the statement by Moldova that was voiced on the 24th of October during the meeting in Chisinau with representatives of the OSCE that the current situation in the region requires some new dialogue platforms. Hence, they challenge the relevance of the permanent meeting on political issues within the negotiating process on the Transnistrian settlement, the so-called 5+2 format. We strongly disagree with this way of putting things. We consider these judgments as an attempt to derail international legal platform for the Transnistrian platform that proved to be efficient. Once again, we urge the Moldovan party to abstain from statements that impede the comprehensive Transnistria settlement. And by the way, I would like to address to the officials in Chisinau. If you dare speak to our ambassador, I can only say that we retaliate to your rhetorics. If there is no rhetoric by you, if there are no anti-Russian actions or statements, there will be no comments by us. So leave your protest to yourselves. Stop dealing with this pure Russophobia, and in this case, we'll not have the need to comment on all this. Let's get down to the Middle East settlement. We're seriously concerned about the situation in the occupied Palestinian territories, the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, as well as the Gaza Strip. On a daily basis, we receive alarming reports on civilian casualties amid the Israeli anti-terrorist raids. There are casualties among Israeli servicemen, and the current situation is a result of many years of stagnation in the Middle East settlement. Russia urges all the parties to exercise restraint and to immediately abandon violence. A serious share of responsibility for this tragic state of affairs is borne by the United States and the European Union. Upon the pretext of the Ukrainian developments, Washington and Brussels distracts the attention of the global community from the regional conflicts, including the Israeli-Palestinian issue. They halted interaction with Moscow in the Middle East Quartet that brings together Russia, the US, the UN, and the EU. It is a unique diplomatic channel that was endorsed by the UNSC resolution. The position of Russia has been consistent, credible, and long-term. The solution to the Palestinian problem is possible only on the basis of a UN-endorsed two-state solution. Palestine and Israel should coexist in peace and security. We do not tolerate attempts to deviate from this principle or to replace it with some kind of dubious options, for instance, an alternative motherland for the Palestinians. Such ideas are promoted by those who want to plunge the Middle East in chaos, to derail the unifying trends. Many years of stalling in the political settlement is actively used by the opponents of the peaceful settlement. Violence, together with the settlement policy and attempts to unilaterally revisit the status of shrines in Jerusalem, only fuel the situation, thus undermining prospects for an independent, integral Palestinian state. A way out of this vicious cycle, as we see it, is to restore the Israeli-Palestinian negotiations and to restore international interaction, primarily within the Quartet. Russia is ready for the collective effort, and we, in our national capacity, seek to continue our relationship with all the parties of interest to revitalize the situation in the Middle East and to address regional problems, including the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Moving on to Greece. To be detentions and arrests of Russian citizens on suspicion of filming critical infrastructure and illegal use of UAVs. Since the 11th of October, there have been 10 detentions, primarily detentions of tourists that use drones as well as photo and video equipment for amateur filming. Russians are being investigated, and the court rules that they should be arrested for several weeks. Groundless detentions are taking place amid deliberate hyping on this Russian intelligence threat topic. Our citizens are basically hunted down, and the local population is being involved. Rank-and-file Norwegians are called on to be extremely cautious and to report to the police about any suspicious matters. And the compatriots living in Norway are not immune from that. The Norwegian authorities try to justify these actions, and they justified that, stating that there is a ban on the use by Russian individuals and legal entities of any aircraft. And when they try to justify the use of amateur video equipment by tourists, they couldn't find any explanation. Basically, these persecutions of Russians are based on the anti-Russian spy mania that is witnessed in Norway. Some technical means that mustn't be filmed, and this information is basically not known to the tourists that come to this country. The tourists are not briefed on the list of facilities that they should not film, that they should not take picture of. And in this regard, since the Norwegian side has not notified us that some of the facilities should not be filmed, and they have not notified us on the order of this filming, we recommend that the Russian citizens that want to visit Norway should carefully weigh all the risks as they plan their trip, and they should be prepared that they will be of special interest to the Norwegian security services to the law enforcers, and to avoid any incidents, they should not carry any professional video and photo equipment. And those Russians that come to Norway should avoid filming these sensitive facilities. Once again, I would like to note that when I say sensitive sites, sensitive facilities, I want Norway to make some specific reference to what kind of facilities they were talking about, because even lavatories could be called sensitive facilities, but we can only warn our citizens about that. You shouldn't use the UAVs in the Norwegian territory in accordance with the legislation that Norway has. And a small announcement, on the 3rd to 7th of November, there will be an educational campaign, the Great Ethnographic Dictation. It's the 7th time that we have this dictation under the motto, Many People, One Country. It seeks to preserve the development of ethnic and cultural identity of the peoples of Russia. The event brings together millions of Russians and foreigners, regardless of their age, education, religion, and citizens. The dictation for the first time took place on the 4th of October 2016. In 2021, the campaign was attended by over 2.5 million persons from 85 Russian entities and 95 countries of the globe. And they represent all of the continents. By the way, even cosmonaut Sergei Prokopyev participated in this event during his orbital mission at the International Space Station. If you want to test your skills, either online or in person, we invite all of you who are interested in history, in culture, and those who would be interested in this event. And in this regard, the Federal Agency on Nationalities organizes this dictation not only in Russian and in English, but also in Spanish. Oh, it's quite easy to take part in this contest. You need to register on the website from the 3rd to the 8th of November. We will send you the link, and you need to answer the test questions. And with that, I'm ready to take your questions to have international life.
Good afternoon, Maria Vladimirovna. This week, Charles Michel, the head of the European Council, mentioned the independence of Kiev while making a decision on possible talks with Russia. Do you think that this statement corresponds to the reality? You know, when you're asking such a question, you don't mean the fact of this quotation. Yeah, okay, I just needed to ask you about that. The question is very interesting because Charles Michel has mentioned the necessity of Kiev's independence while making a decision on talks with Russia. And he says that this independence has already been showed, but I've seen that the head of the Liga fraction of the Italian parliament has stated that Kiev is not supposed to take all the decisions on the future of Ukraine independently, and that the international community is to play a role in this process, bearing in mind the interests of the country. It's a direct quotation. It's a bit hard to hear you saying that the Ukrainians will decide. Of course, we need to respect their will, but it would be better to say that the international community will make a decision bearing in mind the interests of Ukraine. I understand that it's a statement by a political party. You've quoted the head of the European Council. He's an official. He has a right to make such statements. But what I'm trying to say is the diversity of views between an allegedly consolidated West. They are united only by two things. First of all is it's Russophobia, and then it's a fear that measures will be taken against individuals. So those are the only two things that unite them. In reality, they don't even understand how to assess what is going on, how to project the future, and they have absolutely different stances. As for the essence of this global issue, let me comment on that. If this independence of Does this independence of Kyiv's regime in negotiation exist? No, it doesn't. Kyiv is not independent within this negotiation process. So first of all, Kyiv is used by Washington, London, and then Brussels as well. It's allowed to. There is also a dictatorship on the part of this mentioned Western countries that are implementing their interests involving Ukrainian politicians and the Ukrainian regime. And there is also this extremist logic, I have partially mentioned it already, of the representatives of Kyiv's regime who are trying to demonstrate to their handlers or to give an impetus to them. It's, a classical logic of the Western countries. It has created monsters, and then these monsters wanted to take revenge. We know a lot of examples of that. For example, Osama bin Laden, who was a representative of the Western world, he got an education in West. He was financed by West. And then at some point of the history, he became someone who was the most serious enemy for those who had created him. And such tendencies are also quite illustrative here. There is no interest in the independence of Ukraine. Kyiv's regime has come to power not in a democratic way. There was a whole series of coup d'etat. They are trying to show themselves and to prove themselves to be democracy-oriented people, but they are not. And the Ukrainian community is multifaceted, it's multi-confessional, and so on. And they conducted a policy imposed from abroad to in their country and international platforms. But when something contradicts personal interests and views of these representatives of this Kyiv's regime, when they are personally not satisfied with something due to some reasons, then the situation is different. For example, they start acting as extremists, as people who use blackmailing. We have already given a lot of examples. Let's talk about examples. Let's recall the Ukrainian-Russian talks in February and March. They stopped in April, and the Ukrainian authorities initiated these talks themselves. They wanted to show that it was their initiative. We heard such statements. So they took part in 3 rounds in person in Belarus, and a document was signed in Istanbul on the 29th of March. It contained the framework of future arrangements. They worked on them, and you remember that those people who took part in these talks were killed afterwards. Then this process just stopped, not replying to our suggestions as of the 15th of April. Obviously, it was done upon the order of their English handlers who watched and followed the talks closely and who had other objectives but for the achievement of peace. They were more interested in the escalation of this conflict. Previously, similar situations had taken place on an repeated basis in the framework of the Normandy format. Then Zelensky refused to adopt a document harmonized in Paris in 2019, and he insisted on replacing the provision of withdrawal of troops along the touchline with a provision on withdrawal of them only at separate sites. This list can be continued. It confirms that the West has never been interested in the peace in Ukraine, and it has just controlled the Ukrainian authorities, and these Western handlers always used who was in charge when there was at least some progress in the talks in Russia. And Washington has never concealed that it feels very sensitive towards the Normandy format where it's not present, and toward the Minsk agreement. And we've always understood that they block the work of the Kyiv regime in the framework of these formats when there is some progress that can be achieved. At all times, the United States intervened and they introduced their conditions, not being any part of this negotiation process. They just worked through Kyiv. And today, Great Britain and the United States just forbid Kyiv to conduct such talks. As for the EU and its member countries, their actions and their statements only prolong this military confrontation. Contrary to the interest of their citizens, these countries deliver weapons to the Kyiv regime, consolidating this statement of all permissiveness and impunity. And the Ukrainian leadership believes that there is a carte blanche to continue killing the peaceful population, to continue shelling residential items on infrastructure. And we know that in the same EU countries, first of all in Berlin and Paris, there was an attempt to undermine the Minsk agreements. Unfortunately, we cannot talk about any sovereignty of Ukraine when there is this regime in power. Unfortunately, for many years, it has been a puppet of its Western handlers. If you don't have any more questions, let's move on. Thank you. Do you have Izvestia with us? Yes, good afternoon. My question is the following. Is a meeting scheduled with the Ukrainian delegation on the margins of the G20? You know, I won't mention this specific format, but I can say that we haven't received any official requests from Ukraine regarding a meeting with Lavrov on the margins of any meetings or events. Thank you. And as for talks with Ukraine, our position on this question is well known. It hasn't changed. I have just commented on it in details, and there have been no changes in that. We have repeatedly talked about our readiness for a dialogue with Kyiv, responding to its demands to maintain a dialogue, and we've always done it taking into account the new territorial realities and the situation on the ground. It's not a question to be addressed to us. It's a question for the Kyiv regime. We've mentioned today that the Kyiv regime has withdrawn from the negotiation process, and after that they were against any kind of talks. In May, Zelensky said that Ukraine was to get back all the territories as of the 24th of February, and only then it would sit down at the negotiation table. It happened in May. By the autumn, the rhetoric had become even tougher, and on September the 30th of this year, Zelensky signed a decree stating that it was impossible to hold talks with Russian president. Later, he explained that Kyiv was supposedly ready for negotiations with Russia, but only with another Russian president. And that's kind of a division that just unimaginable. There is nothing to add to that, and Washington is to be well aware of all this maneuvering of the Kyiv's regime. For them not to reiterate all the time that it was Russia who wasn't ready for talks. Thank you very much. Are there any touch lines? I'm sorry, could you repeat again? Are there any touch lines? Are there any common points on which we can still talk to Ukraine? I would like to remind you that the answer to this question is shocking for everyone. You know, Ukraine it has never even withdrawn from the CIS, and it uses all the benefits given by this organization. They take everything which is beneficial for them, despite the demands addressed to all over the world to sign some kind of petitions to break their relations with Russia. They take all the benefits that they can from Russia, from integration with this country, from integration structures and organizations involved in it. And there are a lot of other aspects that, despite the statements of the Kyiv's regime, are just a part of the contacts that it's impossible to stop, even for Zelensky. That's just realities. But if we are talking about the fact of them being double-faced, I have just given you an example. If I talk about their representatives at the level of presidents, ministers, and even ambassadors, people believe that they are not there. No, it's not like that. Their representatives are there, and they use all these advantages.
Так,
So we proceed. Russia Today. Do you hear me? Russia Today. Yes, hello. Hello, Maria Vladimirovna. We have the following question. The Nobel Fund decided not to invite ambassadors of Russia and Belarus to the ceremony of Nobel Prizes for 2022. So how can Moscow comment on this decision? As you know, all the actions of representatives of this structure become more and more interesting. They have their own world, of course, they have their own rules, and they can interpret them on their own discretion, at their own discretion, and which is surprising to the whole world. As you remember, the year 2009, less a year ago, when Obama was a president of the United States, and before he did not do anything in international life. And so he has started being active in international issues. He took his post less than a year, and then he received a Nobel Prize for contribution to international efforts in a number of areas. So I remember everybody was shocked. So despite the fact that this organization has a right, but it's really strange and surprising. I remember it produced an effect of an explosion. Nobody could believe that this can be possible when he receives a prize for something he did not know, he did not do. And many said that it was just for credit. And we saw other same facts. As for other prizes we've talked about today, so I can say that the instruments are highly politicized. The instruments who are devoted to have nothing in common with the politics. Because as we know, politics is not a good thing. In order to maintain all the spheres of communication between people and through achievements of people to unite the international community. And right now we have irreversible changes. So political situation is fueling the current situation. And so our history is politicized. And it's just killing the very sense of this prize. And responding to your question, I can say that indeed the heads of all accredited diplomatic missions are invited to the Nobel Prize ceremonies in Stockholm. This decision by the Nobel Foundation, as you've mentioned, is yet another example of the Russophobic attitudes that have infected all sectors of Swedish society. Unfortunately, by such steps, the foundation continues to destroy its authority as a competent and unbiased arbiter of the achievements of scientists from different countries in the field of science. So I would like to recall the words of Alfred Nobel himself. I won't say his attitude towards Russia. I believe that you can have a look yourself. But he said, a good reputation is more important than a clean shirt. A shirt can be washed, a reputation never. So it would be good if those who organize these ceremonies and those who are responsible for the existence of this Nobel Prize remember this. So this démarche by the Nobel Foundation, the style of the engaged collective West campaign to abolish culture, will have no effect on our country's resolve to protect our interests. The attempt to ignore Russia and Belarus cannot erase the undeniable contribution which has made and continues to make the best minds of our countries in the development of the world science. We wish that this organization will distance itself from these extreme manifestations of the so-called nationalism. Okay. If you don't have any other questions, so we proceed further. And ведомости. Good afternoon, Marina Vladimirovna. So we have a question concerning Konstantin Zatulin, that the Armenian authorities banned his visit to Armenia. What can the minister say about this? Were there such precedents before from Armenia? And what consequences can this situation have for diplomatic relations between Russia and Armenia? As for the motivation, I mean for those who banned Konstantin Zaitulin, and as I know, Margarita Simonyan is also banned the entry into country. So it's up to the relevant country. As for us, these statements, we were surprised by them. I would like to recall that here we talk about the ban to the State Duma deputy and the RT editor-in-chief. So through diplomatic channels, we immediately turned to the Armenian side for official confirmation and clarification. So we saw such reports, and we officially asked for clarification. And if it's confirmed, we believe we proceed from the fact that if this information is confirmed, it is difficult to qualify this as a friendly step corresponding to the allied nature of our relations. As soon as we receive official response, we will determine our next steps response. So I would like to say I'm not sure that I should do this, because both Konstantin Zatulin and Margarita Simonyan traditionally advocate on a regular basis, which is well known, and I think we need to listen to their statements. So I can just repeat, just in case, that they advocate traditionally the comprehensive strengthening of bilateral ties, allied ties, and interpersonal contacts. I believe so. This is especially true. So can be no doubts. I have not heard any other statements from them. Of course, they are public figures. They have their own assessment of what is happening, and that they act in order to promote the development of our bilateral relations. So nobody has ever doubted in this. So that's why it's deploring if such artificial pretexts would be imagined in order to put a wedge into relations between Moscow and Yerevan. Is this the first case? I would like to address you to the other side. So we cannot say if it was the first precedent. As soon as we know, so we can tell you for sure. Thank you. Thank you. We have a W Radio Colombia. Colombia. No. Then Rater. Yes. Good afternoon. We have two questions. The first concerning the Green Deal. I mean, declaration of Sergei Lavrov, who on Monday said that Russia will ask the UN Secretariat for statistics on the movement of Ukrainian grain to the end consumer. So just to make it clear, as I understood, this concerned the part of the grain, about 50% from the whole volumes, which goes to the European Union, which, according to the UN, to the EU, is then sent to the poorest countries. So in this regard, could you clarify the minister's words? So about what concrete adjustments of the grain deal? So what plans for its adjustment are being discussed in the ministry? And what positions, from the point of view of the foreign ministry, should be subject to adjustments? So my answer will consist of two parts. As you know, this grain deal, that grain deal on Ukrainian grain, was concluded for 120 days, and its first phase ends on November 18th. We also signed the memorandum between Russia and the United Nations for 3 years. As you know, the UN Secretary General has said that it's about the package deal, that that both parts of these agreements have equal sense, that you cannot interpret as implementation of one part and ignore the other part, or vice versa. So this deal, this agreement, which must be implemented in parallel. It cannot be denied by the participants because they are a part of the whole. So this idea belongs to the Secretary General, which was then reaffirmed as a package deal. What we see. So the part concerning the Ukrainian grain, it's implemented with some problems, but it is implemented on the basic level. Inside this implementation process, or following the outcome, we see that this motivating part, this motivation, which initiated the whole conversation on the need to conclude a deal, at this very moment, it does not correspond to what was to targets and objectives of the West, and it's quite clear, and I've also talked about this today, because they declared that they need to feed all those who are in need, and our president said that unfortunately we see unproportionate from point of view of motivation, unproportionate realization of these initiatives in order to feed the interests of the West. As for the memorandum, so we don't see any results. And this is a fact. We have mentioned this to the UN Secretary General. I mean, the negotiations between our foreign minister with Mr. Guterres in New York. We talked it through our permanent mission. We talked about it openly, as well as during the meeting of the ministers, of the deputy minister, foreign ministers, with his UN colleagues. We gave clarifications. So we are not satisfied with what is going on. And we raise this issue on a regular basis because, as you know, and I would like to repeat that this package, that this deal is a package of deal, and all parts must be implemented. Because there are some problems in life which were not invented by us, but we have to, and in this case, we must altogether overcome them. And apart from this, we should need a desire to overcome these problems rather than the desire to conserve them or create other additional problems. As for the second part of the deal, I refer to our Russian fertilizers and Russian grain, which will supply to those countries who need it. So our accounts in relevant banks were just blocked. So the relevant operations cannot be performed because the payments are blocked due to the sanctions by the West. Despite statements that there are no problems, the problems exist. So if there were no problems, we would not raise this issue. So before November 18th, we will define our policy in accordance with the information we have. As for the second part of your question, as for the details, I believe that very soon we will provide you material prepared by our experts and publish it on our minister's website.
Thank you. And my second question, it concerns the developments that happened the day after yesterday when 30 congressmen, representatives of the left wing of the US Democratic Party first sent, and then at the same day they withdrew a letter to President Joe Biden with a request, and I am going to cite them, to seek a settlement in Ukraine through negotiations. At the same time, one of the representatives of the Democratic faction in Congress commented on the withdrawal of this letter, stating that Russia does not recognize diplomacy, only force. So I would like to ask you to comment on it. So I believe that no American congressmen should say that they do not recognize diplomacy because they themselves approve numerous resolutions, acts, statements, and so on and so forth that contradict the law and what is connected with diplomatic relations, bilateral, multilateral, at international venues, and so on and so forth. So I do not have to cite some examples because you can see it with the sanction lists, numerous documents that and numerous initiatives that emerge by surprise, and they adopt this initiative, they legalize them. And the second point, so I believe that the U.S. shouldn't talk about diplomacy because since the Ukrainian deal, it was a diplomatic channel, but then they withdrew from the deal, violating the provisions of the withdrawal from this deal. So they did it because they changed their mind, their interest changed, and thus they ceased the participation of the U.S. by passing its own position, the position that it itself has been elaborated for so many years, because you remember that the deal became a part of the UN Security Council resolution, so they wanted to do so. They wanted to withdraw from this treaty, and I believe that they shouldn't talk about diplomacy. And if we are talking about force and coercive measures, I would like to recall them that in Afghanistan for 20 years, they were not promoting democracy, but instead they were occupying territory without any explanations. The reasons for that were unclear. It was a NATO military operation, and they have never explained their reasons for this military operation, let alone death casualties and so on and so forth. Do you need other examples? I do not remember whether it was a negotiation process through which they acted in Yugoslavia, and it is only for the last 20 years. For example, in Latin America, in Asia. So these continents know how the U.S., so to say, cares about diplomacy, but instead they promote force and coercive measures. So I believe that they shouldn't talk about diplomacy. It is my first point. Secondly, in terms of this story in particular, I believe that some congressmen first sent a letter, then they withdrew it. I believe that thus they interpret their functions, their competences. I believe that it is in line with check and balance principles of the American leadership. They said that that one branch of power does not influence on another one, but it is not like that, because this very principle contradicts the practice they are preaching right now. Please do not forget that in November there will be elections in the country. Maybe it is a part of their political game, but I don't know. I cannot say it for sure. Do we have the portal newsroom? Yes, we're present. Good afternoon. I have several questions. The first one, Vladimir Putin's meeting with the leaders of Armenia and Azerbaijan. Please do not spare your time, because all these events are commented upon by the president's administration. So my second question is about discussion that are underway on the Persian Gulf and Black Sea transport corridor through Iran, bypassing Russia. So what is the position of the Russian foreign minister on this topic? So I believe that the Minister for Transport should comment on it. So we are talking about the initiative of Iran proposed in 2016 with the participation of Armenia, Georgia, Bulgaria, and Greece. So one more time, I would like to say that you should address your issue to the Ministry of Transport, and they will elaborate on it. Thank you. Do we have Greece Open TV with us? So I believe, yes, we are present. Good afternoon. Dear Maria Vladimirovna, I have two questions for you. My first question. We read the European press and it writes a lot about differences between Paris and Berlin over Ukraine. What is your opinion? What is the point of view of Russia about this opposition within the Western consensus? Russia is in contact with Europeans during this period, so or Russia hopes to find compromises, or Russia's interested in negotiations with the boss, that is the US. So what is your position? So not long ago, I stated Michel's words over the situation. So he mentioned the same topic, first of all in one direction, then in another direction. So I believe that in anti-Russian position there is unanimity, and it is indeed so, because they do not admit the Russian position, but there is nothing more that unifies them. And I believe that there is some uncertainty within the collective West, because one part connects with the EU, and this part understands that London and Washington have their own national interests that do not take into consideration the interests of Brussels or the interests of EU countries in particular. And by the way, not long ago, Macron said about it, stating or describing energy crisis in Ukraine and the prices on for energy resources. So that is why I believe that there are plenty examples. For example, I would like to cite another example. The same people inside the EU have different positions, and I cannot explain why they have these different, quite opposite positions. Maybe they can voice only one thing that they are obliged to voice. For example, Borrell is a good example. Right now, he was, in first place, he was talking about peace, then about hostilities on the battleground. So I believe that there is no unanimity within the West. What we can see is the leading role of the US in this process. And there also exists the lack of understanding over future and over future promising perspectives in terms of the disagreements between them. So I don't know. If you're talking about Paris and Berlin, you should address your question to them, but they do not hide that they have these differences. But we believe that it is up to them to address this issue. Another thing is very important. Instead of tug of war between France and Germany, they should understand all the consequences of them to follow the EU instructions, because it led to the collapse of the peace, to collapse to independence of the EU. So I believe that they replaced the position of the EU by those of the US. Right now, they do not preserve their national interests, and it led to Nazi regime. It led to casualties among civilians, as well as destroying of civil and critical infrastructure. It was made by this regime, and the collective West is still neglecting these facts, is still pumping Kiev with weapons, but they should stop it, and it is the only way to stop this conflict. To resolve this conflict, so far the policy of Germany, France, and the European Union, as you can see it, only encourages military and weapons supplies. It only protracts hostilities, and the EU citizens are forced to pay for that. And another question, for example, in Turkish, Cypriot, and Russian press repeat the topic of possible direct flights between the Russian Federation and the occupied territories of Cyprus, as well as the talks that a Russian consular office will be opened on this territory, as well as a possible recognition of this unrecognized state. I'm talking about the occupied territories of the north of Cyprus. So some analysts are sure that in this way Russia took a revenge for the support of sanctions within the EU by Nicosia and Athens. Could you clarify, is it real? So, you know, so many times we have repeatedly explained this situation. That was the Russian foreign minister and the Russian minister in Nicosia, which explained the situation. An interview with Ambassador Andrei Maslov to the Izvestia newspaper clarified the situation. Dmitry Peskov, the head of the administration of the president of the Russian Federation, also clarified this statement, but one more time I'm going to explain the situation. The Russian position on the Cyprus settlement is well known and remains unchanged. We are committed to the resolutions of the UN Security Council, including 541 and 550, which require all members of the world community not to recognize any Cyprus state other than the Republic of Cyprus. The needs of Russians living throughout Cyprus are provided by the consular department of the embassy in cooperation with official Cypriot authorities. As a part of our principal approaches, we are constantly working to improve the possibility for consular services for Russian citizens located in the north of the island, as well as to protect their rights and legitimate interests. And also I would like to stress that I'm not going to repeat our response to these provocations in the press, but in conclusion, I would like to emphasize that unlike the countries of the collective West, we do not operate with such categories as revenge, punishment, or other types of terms. So we do not even use these terms in this very difficult geopolitical situation. So despite the confrontational course of the EU and NATO towards Russia, we do not use these terms, and you know it quite well.
And another thing, you start asking questions about bolstered consular services and why we opened the consular department here or there, why you had online, in-person participation. So there are questions like this. Somebody sees a political motive behind that. Somebody believes that that's because we are not fast enough. I just want to say that take a look at the number of diplomats that were expelled from the Western states. Primarily, we're talking about consular services for our citizens, for our compatriots and the EU citizens. So now we are rebuilding or rather maintaining the constant work, is something that could be called an art, given the limited number of diplomats. In some places, we only have one diplomat and one administrative officer. At the same time, they also have to deal with the political file that they're in charge of. There's a difficult situation on the ground, and naturally, there's a growing number of requests from the citizens, from our compatriots. But when the EU countries publish or leak data on the expulsion of Russian diplomats, nobody asks themselves how their citizens are going to be treated, are going to receive services in our embassies, given that there are joint projects, shared families, common families, and many other things that cannot be addressed by anyone else. Nobody is interested in these matters. Can I have a follow-up question? Did I get it right that any direct flights are not possible from an airport that is not internationally recognized? Press secretary of the Russian president made a statement back in the day that no decisions on a direct flight between Russia and, I quote, the so-called Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus have not been taken. Thank you. Do you have CGTN? Yes, hello. We have 3 questions. A head of the European Commission said that they have a goal of confiscating Russian assets. At the same time, she recognized that there are some legal impediments to this end that are hard to overcome. At the same time, Brussels created a working group that takes stock of the frozen assets. How can you assess this initiative? Well, it is not freezing of assets, it is stealing of assets, and we kindly ask the EU leadership to stop manipulating this manipulating of words and call a spade a spade. You shouldn't speak about freezing or redistributing. You just need to say that they are stealing, and you need to keep up with these stealing practices, because that is what is going on in reality. We see that the EU imposed sanctions, and since 2014, the EU rubber stamps various illegitimate, groundless decisions on freezing of Russian assets. This is a phenomena that has been existing for more than a year, and this practice is aided and abetted by the supreme authorities, legal authorities of the EU Court of Justice. It refuses to protect the property of Russians, and it openly declares the primacy of political reason over law. You know, recently I have watched an interview of a lady. She's in one of the EU countries currently, and she has extreme anti-Russian stance. At the same time, she has Russian citizenship, and she was asked, imagine your property in the EU countries is frozen, is withdrawn. How would you feel about that? And she said, you know what? My hatred towards Russia is that big that I would think, well, on the one hand, it's a personal matter, but on the other hand, I'm convinced that it is only an issue of legal practice. You need only to come to the court, and the court in the EU countries, and everything will be addressed smoothly. It's up to the lawyers to address that, but it will not be addressed at all. It is not resolved at any level. The EU Court of Justice is not some private company. It's the supreme legislative authorities in the EU, and it refuses to protect the property of Russians. It openly declares the primacy of political reason over the law, as I've already mentioned. And now there's a new stage of this drama. They try to find a pretext to get a grip on Russian assets. Basically, we're talking about legitimizing the stealing. The EU has this experience. You do remember that the British monarchy legalized piracy. It just made piracy part of its system, and that's it. I believe that they have found a very good historical example of how they can deal with the situation. Why should we speak about freezing if some kind of law could be adopted or a paper could be drafted stating that it is the right thing to do and you could move on with that and to legitimize it? Moreover, the EU seeks to have a grip not only on the property of private companies and individuals, but also our state reserves. That is why we're talking about arbitrary behavior and robbery, blatant robbery. By the way, the EU recognizes that this confiscation of frozen assets contradicts the current legislation, and that is why this legislation that impedes them from stealing should be improved. And after that, everything will be just fine. I believe that this should be a topic of some kind of a legal workshop, let alone legalization of piracy in Britain. We need to find other examples. Maybe these were the actions when the revolutions unfolded in some European countries, when some things that were deemed illegal all of a sudden started being legal, but I haven't heard any of such sort lately. So all these pseudo-legal practices and its implementation will just bury the reputation of the EU as a champion of the rule of law. And this should be crystal clear. As for the foreign investors, I'm convinced that they will think twice or even thrice whether they need to invest in the EU, where not a single legal guarantee is given for foreign investment. Well, I believe it is also clear how it will impact the current economic situation in Europe. It will not do any good to it. And as for the real confiscation of Russian assets, Russia will take countermeasures to this end. Do you have any other questions? Yes, I have two questions. President Macron criticized the US for double standards in pricing of gas. The Europeans receive the gas and they pay 3-4 times as much as the Americans in their domestic market. And this should be a topic for discussion, according to him. What's your take on that? Well, the only thing I can say is bonjour. Good afternoon. Hello to everyone who just found out what kind of game the US is playing with them. We have repeatedly stated that the interest of energy security of allies and maintenance of competitiveness of European economies by cheap energy resources is something that Washington does not want to take into account. It has a reverse logic to do its utmost to get rid of rivals in global affairs in all senses: energy, science, economy, and so on. Who are the rivals for Washington? Certainly, this is the EU. It has its currency that has strengthened over the past decades, that has become a genuine risk for the dollar dominance. Also Russia, China, but they do not conceal it. But when it comes to the EU, they put this anti-allies model of interaction with Brussels into a very bright package, that it is something that Brussels needs and it is something that is needed to restore the unity in the ranks. But basically, Washington is capitalizing on it. We have been talking about this for quite some time. Listen, the EU received our cheap gas for many years, and this caused irritation by Washington. It forced these countries to abandon our gas. This is nonsense. And it said that it undermines your energy security. This is gibberish. They received our gas. We proposed long-term contracts to them to sign it not on a daily basis, but we urged them to have long-term cooperation. And Washington said, no, you shouldn't receive this cheap gas. You need to purchase expensive gas from us because it is secure. And that's it. In February, Biden said, we will destroy Nord Stream 2 in any case if Russia doesn't do what we want. So that means that when Washington said to the EU that the use of Russian gas is not safe for the European Union, Washington, back in the day, many years ago, knew that this civil infrastructure that supplies Russian energy sources to the EU will be attacked. And in February 2022, it just made it public. And in mid-2022, it just all happened. And that's it. As for the EU, it got used to sustainable supplies of energy from Russia that ensured the due level living standards in the EU. Sectors of the European economy, metal industry, chemical industry, have been benefiting from stable supplies of Russian gas on long-term contracts. Hence, expensive labor force was compensated, as well as more severe environmental norms, and the social sector has been developing in the EU, social services, and this has been done at our expense. Such a model allowed the EU countries to successfully rival with foreign American companies, and at some point in time, the US just got, just decided not to rival because they had to rival not only with the EU but also with other centers of the world, Asia, Eurasia, nascent Africa with its huge resources, enormous potential. Latin America all of a sudden stopped saying yes, sir, after the first entry of US soldiers in its territory. So we see this imbalance, and Washington saw that not everything is controlled by it, and it was not to the pleasing of everyone, for instance, of Russia. As for Paris, maybe they should have asked these questions way before that. And by the way, when Berlin experienced pressure, Paris could have said a couple of words in support of Germany, but maybe this was beneficial to Paris back then. To take it lightly, to take Germany's problems lightly, assuming that they will not be affected, given growing lack of raw materials in Europe, it is clear that the abandoning of Russian energy sources has no economic rationale behind it. It undermines the interests of the EU member states.
It's worth noting that it's a conscious choice by the EU. We've mentioned that they have their own scientists. But on the other hand, we need to take into account that this choice has been imposed. But in March this year, the EU Commission presented its Repower EU plan. Its goal is to move away from Russian energy sources, especially natural gas, in good time before 2030 by increasing imports of liquefied natural gas from other suppliers and accelerating the implementation of renewable energy sources. Later, more ambitious goals were voiced to reduce dependence on Russian gas by 2/3 by the end of 2022. And it's already the end of the year 2022. By that time, it was set as a time frame for abandoning Russian energy carriers. So they wanted to get rid of our energy supplies as soon as possible. And now when they are saying that we have abused the situation, that we exercise an influence on their energy policy, it's not true, because everything is set in their documents that are accessible. They have set this time frame on their own. Do you have any other questions? Yes, I do. One question regards the planned NATO exercise on nuclear deterrence persistent noon, and Russia has notified on its exercises involving the launch of missiles that can carry nuclear charges. At the same time, the United States has deployed its airborne division in Romania and in Poland, and the Russian side also recently announced that it had reached an agreement with Cuba to resume use of the Ludel military base in Cuba and will relaunch an intelligence center there. What is happening is reminiscent of a repeat of the Cuban missile crisis of 60 years ago. How would you assess the global nuclear threat? You know, all the comparisons, all the details, and all the search for parallels are matters of historians. There are a lot of books on the Caribbean missile crisis. Today's events are witnessed by you. If we talk briefly and outline the main common features, I can highlight that in both cases, there were destructive attempts by Washington to gain military dominance at all costs. The goal is still the same: to use any means to ensure its global dominance, to push their self-centered interests. In the 1960s of the 21st century, the deployment by the United States in Europe and Turkey of nuclear missiles targeting the Soviet Union was a reason for crisis. This time, the aggravation is provoked by the harmful for us expansion of NATO into the Eurasian space and the withdrawal from all the parity agreements in the area of security and strategic stability. Thus, then and now, the United States believed and believe that it was and is necessary to take into account our interests. They just undertook active actions to pose a real threat. As for nuclear threat, just like at the times of the Caribbean crisis, it's increasing. We've been talking a lot about that when we've been talking about the intentions of the Kyiv regime. The logic is simple. The more the United States is involved in the support for the Kyiv regime on the battlefield, the more probability of provoking a real nuclear confrontation between the main nuclear powers, which can lead to horrible consequences. As for the differences, having faced a tough response, Washington still continues to escalate the situation, believing that it can do that without any damage to itself. It's a very dangerous approach, and it's a mistake. And I'd like to say that to prevent the worst scenario, current politicians of the United States should show the same consciousness as was manifested by the U.S. leadership at the time of the Caribbean crisis. There are no reasonable alternatives to that. This is a brief response. As for all other details and comparisons, I think that that historians are supposed to work on it. Do we have Moscow Post with us? Yes, good afternoon. I have two questions. Good afternoon. Minister Sergei Lavrov recently said that it no longer makes sense for Russia to maintain its previous presence in Western countries. Could you please clarify what specific changes are coming and why? You know, Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov has already commented on this topic many times, and the press service of the Foreign Ministry has also provided its comments on it. And by the way, during the previous briefing, I also pointed out this question. I'll allow myself not to provide you with a detailed answer because there is no need to knock at the door closed by them, or maybe probably not by them, but to those who had an access to their internal doors. It was just propped up by something on the other side. We did everything to show the benefits of cooperation and available opportunities, but if it's their choice, which is shown in such a way, in such a flagrant way, then we know that there is a huge number of opportunities in other regions where we are expected. We are often accused of being concentrated too much on the Western direction, and people want to see us more in other regions, in other parts of the world. And there's a huge amount of such opportunities. We have always conducted a multifaceted policy, multi-dimension policy. This concept was developed in modern Russia, and it has been implemented in our practical activity. And we will continue doing so. And we need to balance this excessive concentration on the West. The second question. After the meeting with the participants of the Valdai International Discussion Club, Sergei Lavrov, answering one of the questions, mentioned the foreign policy concept. Earlier, there was information that a new version of the foreign policy concept was being prepared to replace the one approved in 2016. Could you tell us about the new version of the document? Not yet, because a new version is indeed being prepared. It's true that there is a new version that's being developed. I'd also like to draw your attention to the fact that apart from the statement by Sergei Lavrov, there is also a comment by Alexander Venedikov, Deputy Secretary of the Russian Security Council, who made a detailed comment on it. We'll include the quotation in the text of today's briefing. Let's proceed. Do we have Anadolu, Turkey? Yes, hello, Maria Vladimirovna. Hello, we have 3 questions. The first one. How can you comment the fact that Ukraine recently accused Russia of artificially delaying inspections of sheep with grain under the grain deal? How can you comment on that? I'm not going to provide any comments because today I've talked a lot on this deal. There are many more problems apart from those that you have mentioned. I have made a reference to Ukrainian representatives. If they don't see real problems, then it's worthless to present such arguments. Thank you. The second question. EU foreign policy chief Josep Borrell, known for his open support of Ukraine, is currently on a tour of Latin America. Do you think that this may lead to the regional initiative of Latin American countries against Russia? So, the gardener has left its beautiful garden and has risked to visit rainforest. If we are quoting Borrell, that's how we can make a resume of his schedule. I don't want to Guess what the reaction of Latin American countries will be. We are well aware of his views, and we are well aware of the views of our Latin American partners, and we are in a direct dialogue with them. We see the attempts of the EU to drag other countries into their confrontational policy, and we see that the other states are persistent. They demonstrate their sovereignty and independence. As for the EU, they use all the means, blackmailing, threats, they violate the main principle of the United Nations Charter on the sovereign equality of states, and the EU doesn't take into account national priority of other countries, their relations with Russia, historical and cultural features of our cooperation under the pretext of democratic changes, solidarization with the EU values. Brussels imposes models of economic and political development on other countries, which put them under control of the West. You know that Burrell is known to the whole world by these words. He has divided the whole world into garden and jungles. He has just expressed once again in a poetic way the colonial philosophy of Western countries and its attitude to the whole world. Then he had to apologize. As for Latin American countries, our approach is clear. We are developing our interaction on a legal basis, and it's founded on the principles I've mentioned. We have an open agenda. We don't look at this region through the mirror of narrow geopolitical interests. That's not our view of the world. We are in favor of constructing bridges, ties. We are for the equality and the mutual respect. And we are against artificial walls and barriers. I'd also like to draw attention to the interview by Sergei Lavrov, Russian foreign minister, to Argumenti and Fakti. It has been given recently, and I will leave a link to this interview in the text of the briefing. I'd like to reiterate once again that we don't make Latin countries choose between us and somebody else. We don't say that if they are not with us, they are against us. That's not like that. We will continue to develop our relations with our Latin American friends as much as we are already too. And the third question, how would you comment on Ukraine's discontent with Israel's reluctance to sell arms? Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky, once again, Ukraine's discontent with Israel's reluctance to sell arms. As for discontent and reluctance, let the states involved in this situation comment on it. If there is something concerning our country, I'm ready to give my comment. But the emotions of the Ukrainian regime have nothing to do with us. There is something involving Russia. Ukrainian President Zelensky said during a video conference organized by Haaretz that Israel's refusal to sell arms has brought Moscow and Tehran closer together. Is it possible? Maybe Zelensky was just in a bad mood at that point of time. Thank you very much. Do we have Ansa Italy with us?
Thanks for asking my questions in English because unfortunately I don't speak Russian yet. And the first question regards the relations between Italy and Russia. As you know, the new Italian Prime Minister, Mrs. Meloni, said that the position of Italy is not going to change regarding the position of Italy in NATO and also regarding, of course, Ukraine and Russia. But a couple of days, 2-3 days before, Mr. Silvio Berlusconi, the head of one of the parties that supports this government, said that he said something very different. He said that he remains a very good friend of President Putin, that he had an exchange of kind messages with President Putin, and he criticized strongly the government of Ukraine and President Zelensky, saying that they have a big responsibility in what is happening in Ukraine. So in the light of all this, how do you see the future relations between Italy and Russia?
У вас вопрос, два моего ответа, но я постараюсь быть краткой. Первое. В результате состоявшихся 25 сентября в Италии досрочных парламентских выборов Джорджа Мелони стала первой женщиной премьер-министром страны с момента рождения Итальянской Республики. Мы с уважением относимся к волеизъявлению итальянского народа. Мы подтверждаем нашу готовность работать с любым правительством Италии на основе принципов взаимного учета интересов и прагматизма. Ну, про международно-правовую основу я, наверное, не должна повторять. Это во-первых. Далее, давайте посмотрим. Вот даже сегодня с утра...
And I have already cited this statement. I can try to say who it was. So Italy said something new regarding Ukraine. So you cited Melanie, Berlusconi, and I can cite Massimiliano Romeo. And you know who this is. This is the head of the party Liga in the Senate of the National Parliament. So quite different statements. So what does it say? What does it mean? So that it can say that in Italy, a political process is very active. Each political force has its own viewpoints and so on and so forth. So it is impossible to make comments on any statement. There is democracy in Italy, democracy with traditions. Each political power has its own shades in approaches. So the next point. So we proceed from the official position. So the official position of the country is important to us. So which should be voiced by officials and will be guided by this. The fourth point, and a very important one. When Melanie spoke about Italy's position in NATO will remain unchanged, and attitude towards NATO wouldn't change, I don't exactly understand what she meant. I think it's up to Italy, but if you ask our comment, we need to understand what she meant exactly. The problem, you see, I believe that the problem is that in NATO there is no position of any individual state in their national capacity, and that is the problem. And I don't know if the new leadership of Italy knows this, but this is a fact. Inside NATO, no one takes into consideration national position of member states, and nobody asks the people of the countries which are members of NATO. NATO's position is formed at the expense of the position of the main player in this structure, the United States of America. While elaborating its position, they do not take into account the position of other countries, and that is the main problem. And all these statements on NATO, they have the right for existence because they are made by public figures. But we cannot, we should admit the reality. In NATO, as well as within the European Union, a new age has emerged, the age of dictatorship, the command system. No democratic institutions inside these structures have not worked for a long time. There is no democracy, no freedom of speech. There is dictatorship of one decision-making center. And what is most interesting, within the last months, we've seen a very interesting phenomenon. When the EU member states, of course, they are NATO member states as well, when they knew the EU position from mass media. So it means that Brussels made decisions without letting know of these decisions the citizens of the countries before the publication. So Brussels coordinated this decision with Washington, and then it was voiced, and only then all other countries knew that this decision was allegedly accepted by them. I don't want to teach anyone in Italy. I just share our opinion on this issue. And I believe the last thing I would like to answer in the context of your question is that I don't want to point to anyone who you cite, but the one thing is exact, that the situation in Ukraine started developing not in 2022 and not even 2014. It was quite a long ago. I mean that after the collapse of the Soviet Union, there were two anti-constitutional coups d'etats realized by the Western countries. First of all, by the United States of America, with support of the European Union. At that time, it included London, Paris, Berlin, Warsaw, 3 Baltic states, all those who committed twice in Ukraine anti-constitutional coups d'etats. So that is why those who really want to know the history of the Ukrainian crisis, they should take into account this thing and not to count this situation and think that this began in February 2022. So excuse me for this simple example, but it's the same as to cure your headache with only pills from headache, believing that if you relieved your aches, that the treatment is ended. So you need to understand the reasons, and then you have a chance to recover. So here's the same. Without understanding the root causes of the developments in Ukraine, you cannot change anything. You should realize this, recognize this. And I think that the West should confess and admit in this. If you have some other questions, I'm ready to answer. I can talk to you individually if you have any questions, so I'm ready. Да, один вопрос. Да, можно задать еще вопрос?
President Macron asked the Pope to call Mr. Putin and Mr. Biden to try a possible mediation of the Vatican. Yesterday, the Secretary of State of the Vatican, Cardinal Parolin, said that they are ready to do anything if a space opens for this. So what do you think about it?
I'm sorry for my smiles. So we cannot perceive this otherwise. Can you imagine the president of the country of France, Emmanuel Macron, with one hand he gives his hand to Vatican, he addresses to Vatican, asking for mediation in peace settlement, and with his other hand he signs the accounts and makes the orders to supply weapons in the zone of the armed conflict in Kiev. I believe that he needs to balance his own viewpoint, otherwise it will be double face. either peace, negotiations, and then mediation, or supplies and endless protraction of the conflict. So how can this live in one man? You'd better ask himself. He's closer to you than to us. If that's all, so then we proceed to other things. Media Alliance of Russian Communities. Good afternoon, Maria Vladimirovna. Your enthusiasm inspires. Thank you. You have already mentioned that next week a world thematic conference of our compatriots will open. Do you plan any patriotic or cultural program for the participants? For example, the visit to the Natural Historic Museum, where you were yesterday and had an address and made an address there, or maybe something else. We have already spoke about this event. Taking into account this intense agenda, there will be 2 panel discussions, 4 thematic sections, and all of them I have listed. Everything will be organized in VDNH. I think that there are a lot of interesting sites in Moscow to see. So you have all opportunities to satisfy your demands in cultural and patriotic program and to visit all our interesting sites of the capital of Russia. So thank you very much. Are there anyone who want to ask a question? And if no, then thank you very much. Then goodbye. So thank you very much. So see you next time. Goodbye.